All right, welcome everyone to another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling how to get our brains working optimally in the workplace.
Yeah, we're going to be focusing on the ways in which biological sex can affect brain function and how that can play out in the workplace.
So we're diving deep into a really fascinating book today.
All the brains in the business, yes.
And in this deep dive, our goal is to pull out what we think are the most important ideas in this book.
Yeah, with the hope of helping you understand those underlying, maybe even invisible neurobiological factors.
That shape how we interact at work, basically.
Absolutely, yeah, and ultimately affect all of our performance.
Okay, so one of the most fundamental ideas in all the brains in the business is that we can't really ignore biological sex differences in the brain if we want to create a workplace where everyone can really thrive.
Yeah, it's so fundamental that the book keeps coming back to it again and again and again.
Right. And to be fair, sometimes it can feel a little bit uncomfortable to even talk about these differences, right?
Sure, yeah, because it can feel like you're walking into a minefield.
Exactly. But what's so interesting is that the book emphasizes that this isn't about saying there's a rigid male brain or female brain.
No, at all. It's not a hard binary.
It's a spectrum.
Absolutely.
And someone's outward sex doesn't actually automatically define how their brain's going to function.
Exactly. And that's a crucial point to remember.
And the book argues that understanding brain gender differences is actually a competitive advantage.
I think that's spot on.
If you understand this stuff, your business is going to be better off than businesses that don't get this.
Yeah, because you're going to be able to structure your discussions in a way that everyone feels heard. You'll be able to take into account different communication styles. And ultimately, I think you're going to get more creative, more effective solutions because of it.
Absolutely. And so let's really dive into this idea of how our brains work. And to do that, we're going to need to explain the triune brain a little bit.
Yeah, this is a good model. Think of it as 3 layers. The first is the limbic brain.
The limbic brain.
Right, and that's the center of emotions, those really deep-seated survival instincts.
Okay.
Then we have the cortex, which is that outer layer, right? That's much more recently evolved and is responsible for more higher-level thinking.
Okay, so the cortex is like the outside, right?
That's right.
The newer part.
The newer part, yeah.
And the limbic brain is more the inside.
It's like our inner core.
Okay, so the limbic brain is emotions.
And survival, yeah. And then within the cortex, we have the prefrontal cortex, or PFC.
PFC, okay.
And that handles rational thought, complex decision-making, sort of the CEO of the brain.
Okay, so the prefrontal cortex, that's our CEO.
Exact.
The limbic brain is emotions.
Yep.
Okay, I got it.
So we've got our emotions, our survival instincts, and then we've got this sort of higher level thinking going on in the cortex.
Got it.
Now, what's really fascinating is that an emotional reaction, which is processed through the limbic system, is much faster than rational thought.
Okay, so how much faster are we talking?
Well, an emotional reaction can take just 85 milliseconds.
Wow, 85 milliseconds.
Yeah, whereas a rational thought process through the PFC can take around 250 milliseconds.
So like almost 3 times as fast.
Pretty much, yeah. So you think about that instant flash of frustration when you receive a demanding email, right?
Right, yeah.
That's your limbic system in action, right? Before your rational prefrontal cortex even has a chance to process it calmly.
Okay, yeah. And the book actually uses the phrase Stone Age brain in the modern world.
Yeah, which is a really nice analogy.
I love it.
Because it speaks to the fact that our emotional responses were really geared towards ancient survival needs.
Like when we had to worry about being eaten by lions.
Exactly. And that's why sometimes those responses can feel a little bit out of sync with the modern day challenges we face.
Right, makes sense.
Like that demanding email. We don't need to run away from a demanding email.
Right, exactly.
We can actually use our PSC, our rational brain, to think about it and respond appropriately.
I like that. Okay, so now let's talk about these core emotions that everybody has. The book says there are 8 of them.
That's right, 8 primal emotions.
5 for survival.
That's right.
1 that can amplify things.
Yeah, a bit of a potentiator.
And then 2 for when we're thriving.
The ones we want to cultivate.
Okay, so let's start with the 5 for survival. What are those?
All right, so the 5 survival emotions are fear, anger, disgust, sadness, and shame.
Okay, and so let's break those down.
All right, well, each of these was really critical for our ancestors when they were facing immediate threats.
Okay.
So, for example, fear.
Fear.
That triggers that fight, flight, or freeze response, and it releases adrenaline and cortisol.
Okay, so that's that super stress response.
That's right.
Okay, so fear is one. What's the next one?
Anger.
Okay, anger.
Yeah, and that prepares us to defend ourselves. It also involves adrenaline.
Okay,
So it gets you ready for action.
to fight back against the lion.
Exactly, exactly. Then we've got disgust.
Okay, just
Yeah, and that one helps us avoid toxins and things that might be bad for us.
right, like rotten food.
Yeah, precisely. And then we've got sadness.
Sadness.
Yeah, and that signals the need for social support and attachment.
Okay, so it brings people together.
Yeah, it can.
Interesting.
And then finally, we've got shame,
Shame.
which can help us to maintain social bonds.
Okay.
So we don't do things that might jeopardize our relationships with others.
Right, interesting. Okay, so those are our 5 survival emotions.
That's right.
Now we've got this one potentiator.
Yeah, which is surprise.
Surprise.
And what's interesting about surprise is that it can kind of go either way.
Okay.
It can intensify a survival response if the situation is threatening.
Okay, so if something bad happens and you're surprised, you're going to be even more scared.
Exactly. But it can also amplify positive emotions if the surprise is pleasant,
Right.
because then it signals safety and opportunity.
Okay, so surprise is basically just a big amplifier of whatever emotion you're already feeling.
That's a good way to think about it.
Okay, I like that. And now the 2 thrive emotions.
The good ones, the ones we want more of.
Yes, tell me about those.
Love, trust. So the book considers those very closely linked.
Okay.
And joy.
Love, trust, and joy.
Yeah, so those aren't so much about immediate danger, but they are essential for well-being and growth.
Right.
Love and trust, foster connection, release oxytocin, that feel-good hormone.
Yeah, and joy.
Joy is associated with reward and pleasure. It involves dopamine and serotonin.
And those are important for learning.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so a brain in a thrive state is more open and effective at work and in life in general, I imagine.
Yeah, because when we feel secure and positive, our brain can really focus on those higher level functions.
So that's the state we want to cultivate in our workplaces, right?
For sure, because those brains are more creative, they learn more effectively, they're more adaptable.
Right. It makes total sense. All right, so now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about nature versus nurture, because it's something that always comes up when we talk about sex differences in the brain.
Yeah, the age-old debate.
The age-old debate.
Yeah.
So what are the key points about how our brains develop that the book makes?
Well, they really emphasize that there are 2 significant periods of physical brain development that are very heavily influenced by our biology. The first is the time that we spend in the womb.
Okay, in the womb, so before we're even born.
Exactly, yeah. And then the second is puberty,
Puberty.
where we experience these huge hormonal shifts.
Right, okay, so in utero, and then when we hit puberty,
That's right, yeah.
what's going on with the teenage brain?
Oh, lots of change during puberty. The brain is being flooded with sex hormones, which trigger substantial changes in the brain's development.
Okay.
For girls, the circuits related to social interactions start to mature a lot, making them much more attuned to those social cues and sensitive to feeling included or excluded.
Right, yeah.
And in teenage boys, driven by testosterone, the brain starts to become much more focused on establishing their social status, their position within a group.
The pecking order.
The pecking order, exactly. So I think it's fair to say that generally girls are more focused on belonging, boys are more focused on where they rank.
Right, and this is all happening at the same time that the prefrontal cortex, which is like the rational control center of the brain, is still developing.
Yeah, it's still catching up. So that mismatch between the development of the emotional parts of the brain and the PFC, that can lead to a lot of the emotional volatility that we see in adolescence.
Right, because they're having these super strong feelings, but they don't necessarily have the part of the brain that can rationalize those feelings yet.
They don't always have that ability to take a step back and think things through calmly.
Right, and it's important to remember that it's not all predetermined by biology, right?
Absolutely. No.
What about epigenetics?
Yeah, so our social environment plays a huge role.
Right, and epigenetics is this fascinating area showing how our life experiences, and even those of our ancestors, can actually affect how our genes express themselves.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it?
That our experiences can change how our genes work.
Yeah, and we know that our experiences affect our neural pathways. So think of epigenetics as like switches on your genes that can be turned on or off.
Okay, I like that.
By your environment.
It's just...
Switches, yeah, and that can influence how your brain develops and reacts to things.
Okay, so that's the power of nurture.
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, I know the book also talks about this trust print tool. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, so trust print is a tool that helps us understand how an individual's early life experiences and relationship patterns can influence their leadership style and how they communicate and their tendencies in relationships as adults.
Okay, so it's looking at how your past experiences can actually shape how you lead and how you interact with other people at work.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a way to really understand the nurture side of things and how that interacts with our biology.
Right. Now, the book also brings in this idea of brains are what we are
Yeah.
with Dick Swab, who's a prominent neurobiologist.
Yes. His work argues very strongly that our biology is the fundamental driver of who we become.
Which is a really strong statement.
It is, and it has big implications for how we think about the workplace.
So what are some of those implications?
Well, the book argues that triggering survive responses in the workplace, those negative emotions like fear and anger, that's actually detrimental to business performance.
Okay, so if somebody's feeling threatened at work, they're not going to be doing their best work.
No, because their prefrontal cortex, that CEO of the brain, isn't going to be functioning properly. They're not going to be able to think clearly, make good decisions, or be creative.
Right, right. And it can come from lots of different sources, right?
Absolutely.
It's not just one thing.
It's not just about the individual's personality or something. There are actually 3 levels where these survive triggers can originate.
Okay, I like this. This is good. Give me the 3 levels.
All right, so the first level is the individual level.
Okay, individual.
Yeah, and that's linked to their personal trust print and how they were, how they were brought up, what experiences they had as a child.
Right, so everyone's got a little bit of a different trust.
Everyone has their own unique sensitivity.
Yeah, so that's one level.
Yeah, then the second level is the systemic level,
Systemic level.
which includes all the organizational factors, like a really transactional culture that doesn't prioritize building strong relationships.
Right, so if you're in a workplace where everyone's just out for themselves, that's going to trigger your survival responses.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because you don't feel safe, you don't feel supported.
Right. Okay, and what's the third level?
The third level is the macro environmental level.
The macro.
Yeah, and that includes all the external stresses and pressures that are outside of the organization's direct control.
So things like the economy, political instability, natural disasters, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, all this stuff that we can't really control.
Right, and the book points out that there's a real cost to having these survive responses triggered all the time in the workplace.
There's a huge cost. You risk losing your most talented people.
Right, because people who are constantly feeling threatened and stressed are not going to want to stay in that environment.
No, they're going to be less engaged, their performance is going to suffer, and ultimately they're going to start looking for other opportunities.
Right. Okay, now let's talk about how these biological differences can show up in areas like attention and communication.
Yeah.
The book talks about this thing called infantile puberty.
Yes, this is a fascinating phase in early childhood where sex hormones start to have a big impact on both physical and brain development.
Okay, so how early are we talking?
We're talking just months after birth.
Wow, okay.
And what's really interesting is that for girls, this period tends to be longer, and it involves a pretty significant production of estrogen.
Okay, so even though these are very young girls, they're producing quite a lot of estrogen.
Yeah, surprisingly, sometimes as much as a fully grown woman.
Wow, that's amazing.
It is, and scientists believe that it plays a key role in setting up the reproductive system.
Okay, so that makes sense. And what does this surge of estrogen in these little infant girls, how does that affect their brains?
Well, it further strengthens the neural circuits involved in communication, empathy, intuition, and the ability to tune into the emotions of others.
Okay, so that lines up with what a lot of people have observed, right?
Yeah, and it's just a fascinating illustration of how biology and experience really work together to shape our brains.
Right, so it's not that girls are just born with these skills fully formed, but their brains are kind of primed to develop them.
Exactly, yeah. And then we see these different self-defense responses between men and women as well.
Yeah, what's going on there?
So women, on average, tend to be a little bit less quick to respond with aggression when they're under attack compared to men.
Okay, that makes sense.
Which is likely due to those lower levels of testosterone in women. And also, they have stronger connections between the amygdala, which is like the brain's threat detector, and the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for regulating those emotional responses.
Okay, so that connection is stronger in women.
On average, yes. And that allows for more considered reactions.
Right, so they're not just reacting instantly, they're able to think about it a little bit more.
Exactly, yeah. And this actually leads into the tend and befriend response that you see in women, which is an alternative to that traditional fight, flight, or freeze response.
Right, because from an evolutionary perspective, women who could seek safety by forming social bonds and nurturing those around them, especially when they were pregnant or caring for children, those were the women who were more likely to make sure their offspring survived.
Exactly. So tend and befriend is all about reaching out for social support, caring for others during stressful times.
Okay, I like that. Now, there's this really interesting study in the book about one-year-old babies and a forbidden object.
Yes, I love this study.
Can you tell me about it?
So in this study, you've got one-year-old boys and girls, and they're told not to touch a particular object in a room. And what happens is that the baby girls, they look back at their mothers much more often than the baby boys do,
Oh,
as if they're seeking, cues for approval or disapproval.
right.
And the baby boys, they tend to explore the room more. They touch the forbidden object more frequently.
Right. So the girls are checking in, am I doing the right thing?
Mm.
And the boys are just like, let's explore, let's see what this is.
Exactly.
Okay. And then the book also talks about how boys and girls develop different speech patterns pretty early on as well.
Yeah, that's right. Girls often use more collaborative language.
Okay.
They frequently start sentences with phrases like, let's play.
To connect with others.
Yeah, to invite others to join them. Whereas boys, while they are definitely capable of using this style, they tend to use more direct language.
Right. More commands.
And they're also more likely to just ignore comments or instructions from girls.
Oh, that's interesting.
Which is just another example of how, these early differences can play out.
Right. Okay. And so how might these differences play out in the workplace? Let's talk about competition and collaboration.
Yeah, so because men, on average, have higher levels of testosterone, they often have this stronger drive towards competition and establishing hierarchies.
So it's not just a stereotype. It's actually got a biological basis.
There's definitely a biological component.
Right.
And we see this on playgrounds where boys establish pecking orders very quickly. And brain scans have actually shown that winning activates reward centers in male brains.
Okay, so they actually get a dopamine hit from winning.
Yeah, there's a genuine neurochemical reward for them.
Okay, so that's competition. Now what about collaboration?
Yeah, so women tend to produce higher levels of oxytocin, which is that bonding hormone, and that promotes collaborative behavior.
Okay.
And again, this is supported by research looking at playground interactions and language patterns. Girls tend to engage in more turn-taking, use more collaborative language.
Right, they're more likely to say, let's do this together than I'm going to do this.
Exactly.
Okay, now that leads us very naturally into the world of office politics. What does the book say about that?
Yeah, well, it defines office politics really broadly as everything from healthy workplace relationships to, manipulative behaviors.
Okay, so it's kind of a spectrum of how people interact in the workplace.
And our underlying brain differences can really affect how we navigate all those social dynamics.
Okay, and the book shares a fascinating fMRI study about empathy and in-group, out-group bias.
Yeah, this one's a classic.
Tell me about it.
So basically, this study showed that people generally experience empathy for others in pain, right?
Right, if you see someone get hurt, you feel bad for them.
But this empathetic response is much, much lower when the person experiencing pain is labeled as belonging to an outgroup.
So even if it's just like a random label.
Yeah, even if it's a completely arbitrary distinction, like you support a different football team.
Right, and so this has really big implications for workplace culture.
Absolutely, because it shows how easily we can fall into this kind of tribal thinking.
Right. And the book also gives an example of a female MD whose contributions were completely overlooked by her male boss.
Yeah, and this really triggered a survive response in her.
Tell me about this case study.
So basically, this MD had worked really hard behind the scenes to make sure that a client presentation went smoothly.
Okay.
But then her male boss publicly thanked the whole team, but didn't specifically acknowledge her crucial role.
Oh, so she felt invisible.
Exactly, yeah. She felt completely undervalued, really demotivated, even to the point where she considered resigning.
Even though she was a valuable member of the team.
Absolutely.
So that just shows how even small things can have a big impact.
Absolutely.
Okay, now the book also talks about how these higher levels of testosterone can lead to these informal power structures, these old boys clubs.
Yeah, because testosterone drives this need to compete and establish hierarchy, right? So those informal hierarchies can emerge really easily.
And the book introduces this concept of equality.
Yeah, so it's about leveraging what they call feminine energy to create a more balanced and inclusive work environment.
Okay, what does that actually look like in practice?
Well, it's about recognizing that different people have different strengths and
Hmm.
that collaboration is just as important as competition.
So it's not about women needing to act more like men to succeed.
No, it's about creating a workplace where everyone feels valued and respected for who they are.
Right, so that's equality.
Mm.
Okay, and then the book talks about alpha positive and alpha negative behaviors.
Yeah, so this is a really important distinction.
Break it down for me.
Okay, so alpha positive behaviors are things like taking strategic action, being decisive, and being a leader in a way that inspires others.
Okay, so those are all good things.
But then there's alpha negative behaviors, which are all about domination and coercion.
Right, so like bullying your way to the top.
Exactly, yeah. And that kind of behavior can really stifle creativity and innovation.
Because people are afraid to speak up?
Exactly, they're afraid to challenge the status quo. And then the book gives this great example of an alpha male interview misadventure.
Oh, what happened there?
So there's this CEO, and he's interviewing this highly qualified candidate for a senior role, but he conducts the interview in a really dismissive, aggressive way.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and unsurprisingly, the candidate ends up declining the job offer.
So they basically scared away top talent.
Yeah, because nobody wants to work for a jerk.
Right. Okay, so now let's talk about trust and communication, because those are obviously really important in any workplace.
Absolutely.
And the book really emphasizes that trust is a core thrive emotion.
Yeah, trust is essential for creating a workplace where people feel safe and supported.
Okay,
And when people feel safe and supported, they're more likely to be engaged and productive.
makes sense.
And the book points out that the amygdala, that emotional memory center, plays a key role in how we experience trust
Okay.
because it encodes memories based on our emotional experiences.
Right.
Which is why it's so difficult to rebuild trust once it's been broken.
Because that negative emotion is like burned into your memory.
Exactly, yeah. Once trust is broken, it takes a lot of time and effort to repair it.
Right. Now, the book also talks about the IHT communication model.
Yeah, this is a really useful framework.
Tell me more about that.
So IE stands for recognition, intention, connection, and hope. And it's all about engaging the emotional brain before trying to engage the rational brain.
Okay, so you're appealing to people's emotions first.
Exactly, yeah.
And then once you've got their attention, then you can start talking about the facts and figures.
Yeah, so the first step is recognition, which is just about acknowledging the other person's perspective.
Right, letting them know that you see them, you hear them.
Then there's intention, which is clearly stating the purpose of the communication.
Okay, so no hidden agendas.
Exactly. Then there's connection, which is all about building rapport and understanding.
Right, so finding common ground.
And then finally, there's hope, which is painting a positive picture of the desired outcome.
So you're giving people something to look forward to.
Yeah, exactly. And this model, it's really versatile. You can use it in all sorts of situations.
Like coaching, giving feedback, having difficult conversations.
Yeah, it can really help to create a more positive and productive communication environment.
All right, so now we're going to talk about meetings, which are something that I know a lot of people dread.
Yeah, meetings can be a real time suck.
And the book talks about how much time people spend in meetings.
Yeah, 23 hours a week on average for leaders.
That's a lot of time.
It is. And the book argues that we're often wasting a lot of that time because we're not effectively engaging all the different brains in the room.
Okay, so how can we do better?
Well, first of all, we need to recognize that traditional meeting formats tend to favor people who are extroverted and quick to speak up.
Right, so the introverts in the room might not get a chance to share their ideas.
Exactly. And we need to make sure that everyone feels comfortable contributing.
Mm.
So the book introduces this 4Cs meeting model, which stands for context, connect, contribute, and conclude.
Okay, and what are those 4Cs all about?
Well, context is making sure that everyone understands the purpose of the meeting from the outset.
Right, so everyone's on the same page.
Then connect is about taking a moment to check in with everyone on a personal level.
Right, so you're building those relationships.
Yeah, and contribute is about actively seeking input and perspectives from everyone in the room.
Okay, so everyone gets a chance to speak.
And then conclude is about summarizing the key outcomes and decisions made.
Okay, so everyone leaves the meeting knowing what's happening next.
Exactly.
All right, I like that. Now let's talk about motivation, because the book's got a really interesting perspective on that.
Yeah, it's very different from a lot of the traditional motivational theories that are out there.
What's their perspective?
So they introduce this concept of emotion as literally energy in motion. And they offer this really compelling metaphor, EMCTA, where E represents human energy within an organization. M stands for the individuals, and C signifies care X capacity.
Care X capacity.
Yeah, which means that if you really want to motivate people, you need to genuinely care about them and give them the resources and support they need to do their best work.
Right, so it's not just about dangling carrots and sticks in front of people.
Exactly. It's about creating a workplace where people feel valued and respected.
And the book actually gives an example of this historical role called the company almoner.
Yeah, which is a fascinating example of how people used to think about employee well-being.
So what did the company almoner do?
Well, they were basically responsible for the social and financial well-being of the employees.
Okay, so they were like a combination of a social worker and a financial advisor.
Exactly.
That's interesting.
And the book argues that we need to rediscover that understanding that people's personal lives have a big impact on their work.
All right, so we can't just treat people like robots who come to work and then leave all their personal problems at the door.
Absolutely.
Now, all this talk about motivation leads us into a discussion about exhaustion and burnout.
Yeah, and the book makes a really important point that a lot of burnout comes from a lack of understanding of a person and the absence of energy as a core concept in management.
Right, so we're not really thinking about people's energy levels when we're setting expectations and deadlines.
And that's a big problem.
Okay, so what's going on physiologically when somebody's experiencing burnout?
Well, burnout is basically the body's response to prolonged chronic stress. It leads to a dysregulation of the HPA axis, which is the body's main stress response system.
Okay.
So imagine you've got this alarm system that's going off all the time.
Right.
That's what happens when we're constantly stressed.
Okay, so it's like your body is stuck in fight or flight mode.
Exactly.
And the book also talks about some gender differences in how we respond to stress.
Yeah, so while women might report more physical symptoms of stress, they also tend to seek out social connections more readily.
So they're more likely to reach out for support.
Exactly.
Okay, now the book talks about creating the mind of the organization.
Yes, so it's about thinking of the organization as a whole, just like the different regions of the brain have to work together.
And the book uses the analogy of brain regions versus organizational departments.
Yeah, and it points out that we often waste a lot of energy defending those boundaries.
Right, like when departments are competing with each other instead of cooperating.
Exactly.
And it suggests that our current organizational structures might be reflecting more male ways of organizing.
Yeah, because they're often very hierarchical and competitive.
Right. And then Angela talks about her oil tanker analogy.
Yeah, where she talks